The last of the colonies that we'll discuss as a cluster reference are New England colonies, the clustering to the north. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Notice, by the way, if you look at the map up here, Maine, what you would consider to be Maine, is actually part of this narrow little stretch here, part of the entire Massachusetts colony. In earlier lessons, we've learned how New Hampshire split away. The original Massachusetts Bay Company tract called for a charter of that region there. New Hampshire was chiseled away, but the entire Massachusetts portion is still part of it. So Massachusetts is actually a far larger landmass when you're talking about a colonial holding than you would probably expect to see thinking of the map as it is today. Because of New England's climate and geography, you're going to have to see the New Englanders had to become economically diverse by necessity. They could not make a living farming because of the short growing season, frigid temps in the wintertime, the generally rocky and sandy soils, not going to generate the highest yields like you would see out of far more attractive farming regions in the middle and southern colonies. So as such, they had to diversify in order to meet the profits necessary for the Massachusetts Bay Company to pay dividends, but also to survive. So this was going to lead them into a host and a range of other activities. They were going to be into the fur trade, into fishing, into the sailing activities. We talked about the ship construction and the ship navigation trades. An awful lot of the slaves that came on the slave trade came on ships that were built in Yankee shipyards and were captained by Yankee captains and perhaps crewed by Yankee crews, even though the slaves were going to southern and West Indies destinations. Rivers in New England were going to be short and rapid, so you're not going to have the kind of interior movement along the rivers of the fur trade that you would have had in the middle colonies. And additionally, notice your last point. The Native Americans were generally seen as leaving the land as empty space, and nature was seen as something to be controlled by the white man. So the colonials saw the Native Americans as savage, primitive, and the proof of this was they had never developed the land. They had left it as it was, which the New Englanders essentially saw as slovenliness or even sin, and that you had to take nature and develop it and put it towards human purposes rather. So moving on then to family structure. Understand the family experience was going to vary significantly depending on where family was, and this goes with linkage all the way back to the settlement of our colonies. The Virginia colonies, the Chesapeake colonies, were settled largely by white, single, unattached males. So women were very scarce and in high demand, and as such, the families were very different down south. You quite often had a woman who would remarry several times in her life and outlive her husbands. Whereas in New England, the reverse was going to be true when you had the established settled family model in many ways, but life in the Virginia colonies was far different. New England, because of winter winds up providing a useful decontamination chamber. The freezing of winter provides for a die-off of all the insects that would carry the kind of diseases like malaria, smallpox, etc., that the colonials were likely to get. And so by killing the insects and also maybe killing some of the germs that allowed these diseases, New England was going to have a healthier climate, cleaner water than you would see in the more humid, more malarial, more mosquito-infested, swampy lowland areas of the Virginia Tidewater and beyond and south. Notice that women, when they married, tended to marry early, and you saw large families. Now, when you see large families, you're seeing large families in terms of a large number of live births. And it did not mean that all these children were going to live through to full adulthood. So a typical woman was going to essentially spend a large number of her childbearing years in childbearing. Death and child labor was not the number one killer of women, but it was right up there. So as such, with your final point, notice that women in the South were going to have more power because women were a scarcer commodity. So they could command more in marriage, and essentially were going to be sought after by even the elites because there weren't going to be a lot of women around to marry in the large population imbalances of the South. In New England, it was not going to be that way. The women and men were in more proportionally equal numbers, which was going to mean there was going to be a corresponding lessening of women's power in that society. For example, when it came to inheritance law, in many times in the southern colonies, women were able to inherit full estates, but make full legal claim and title to them, and involving themselves in the legal process of the documents and contracts with those laws because their husbands might not be around to do it. They could very well be dead. In New England, the reverse was true, where you wound up having women having not necessarily complete subservience to men. Divorce laws and rape laws, adultery laws bear that out, but they had much more power for women in New England in the family unit than they did in the southern colonies. Moving away from family, we want to discuss colonial life as it pertains to religion. Now, in earlier lessons, you've probably learned and talked about on your own the fact that Over time, the Puritans first showed up as very devout people. Remember our 3 G's, gold, glory, God? The Puritans come for God. The Virginia Company, they come for gold in many ways, but there's still an issue of them being Anglicans. They've got a religious faith. They're not coming as a whole bunch of atheists. And over time, what was happening is here in these colonies, you saw that the colonial establishment and the colonial bounty, the kind of life you could live here, led people away from faith. It led them away from church and more into the day-to-day business of earning a living and pursuing a living and acquiring material goods, acquiring material comfort, living for the here and now. And the churches fought against this. It's a long losing battle they're fighting, a long tug of war losing battle they're fighting to try to maintain that same devout religious hold on the people that the very first generation of Puritans who showed up in Massachusetts and at Plymouth had. Ultimately, as the church faded, you saw over time a religious rebirth, and this religious rebirth is known by the name of the Great Awakening. And what were the elements of the Great Awakening? What it was you had the Anglicans in the South and the Congregationalists, the former, that we used to call them the Puritans, in the North, and this fading faith. You had a series of preachers who said, if we can't bring people to the religion, maybe we need to bring God to the people. And so among the elements of the Great Awakening was enthusiasm. I guess you could call it in-your-face religion. Make the notions of faith and fire and brimstone, the fact that God is there, God's watching, and God is passionately interested in what you are not up to as an individual, make that something too big to ignore. So make religion this directly personal experience, which was very different than what it was in the New England churches and the Anglican churches, where it had become sit and listen to the sermon and simply followed the standard theocratic line of whatever religious doctrine was going to be for your particular region. So you had this issue of enthusiasm. We have emotional manifestations, weeping, fainting, physical movements and convulsions, people literally getting the fear of God put into them and being seized by that evangelical moment. Second of all, it was characterized by itinerancy. You had essentially circuit preachers who were riding a circuit, heading to the areas. Remember, bring religion to the people. People can't come to the faith, go into the frontier and bring the religion to them. Which is why these awakenings, in many ways, while they're going to affect all aspects of society, these awakenings are going to manifest themselves first in the unsettled frontier areas, in these camp meetings, and they're going to work their way from the outside in. They're going to work their way from the hinterlands inwards, and it's going to be a religious revival that moves from west to east as the fires take off and catch among these religious people, or these religious beliefs rather, for having this major transformational event in communion with the Almighty. The third thing that this is going to do is it's going to lead to a challenge between religious authorities, between the the so-called old lights, who said be traditionalists and preach the old way, don't change, let the people come to us because we have the right theology, and the new lights, who said no, it's all got to change. We've got to modify and alter and shift our policies to make religion fit and meet the people where they are and bring the faith to them if we can't bring them to, and that'll bring them to the faith in the long run. So this is going to start fracturing churches off. The two most key preachers of this movement, if you will, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, are the two key figures, the most popular, most well-known figures in the American colonies. Jonathan Edwards' most famous tract or sermon on this, many of you may have read it in your American Lit class, your English courses, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was essentially bringing it to people in direct ways that God it's that Old Testament fire and brimstone, wrath of God. God is angry about the way that we've let him down, and you need to get in touch with that and get in touch with your inner soul and realize that your soul is in peril, in mortal danger, and you need to change your ways or a host of unpleasant things are going to be waiting for you in the hereafter. So the consequences of this movement, it's a movement that winds up being sort of democratic, actually, because what it does is it takes power away from religious established institutions and puts it into the hands of the people, saying essentially, we can have this personal relationship with God, not coming from the guy in the pulpit telling me through reading his chapter and verse what my religious experience ought to be like. So it stirs an impulse towards independence among colonists, and it breaks down these denominational ties, which you could kind of call social leveling. It affected all aspects of society. It started out in the rural areas, but it worked its way into the cities and affected all classes of society, from the highest to lowest individuals. So it winds up being this broad-spreading movement that's an individual revival versus the cold rationalism of Puritanism and Anglicanism. And it puts religions into the hands of the common person. So it's got political consequences. After all, if I don't necessarily have to follow what my preacher says, I can find my own weight of my own relationship with God and find my own answers through reading of the Bible and through, having these manifestations, these experiences of being deeply religious. Maybe I shouldn't have to follow all my civil and political orders either. Maybe those guys don't have all the answers, just like the way the old Puritan minister didn't always have all the answers. It's also going to lead to a host of new faiths that show up that did not exist prior. The Episcopalians, the Baptists, the Methodists. You're going to see a large number of fundamentalist faiths, evangelical faiths, come out of this movement. And lastly, to conclude, we'll move beyond religion. We're tying some things together between the family, the regionalism, but the colonial culture. When you're looking at the colonial culture, you've got to understand that with education, like everything else, there's an awful lot of regional variation. In New England, from the earliest times, education had been important. Remember, they came as a community. They came as a community for God. And if they're coming as a community for God, you've got to be able to read Scripture. And you've got to be able to understand Scripture, not from having it told to you, but being able to read it so you can read it on your own after it's been told and taught to you about the things that are going to happen in church. So from the earliest Puritan settlements on, public education became increasingly important at the primary and then later on secondary school level. Out of the Great Awakening, you're going to see a whole host of universities established, which were all designed, the original Ivy League, which were designed as seminaries. They were originally theological schools to train ministers for that own particular branch of faith or calling. Harvard, William & Mary, Princeton, Yale, Brown, etc. were all founded to establish divinity schools for the teaching of ministers to be Congregationalist ministers or Puritan, Baptist, Presbyterian, etc. So education will vary. In the South, education, as we said, is going to be more of a class-based issue. But notice what the national character was. Life was humble but comfortable. And increasingly, in a phrase that you'll hear historians use, America was getting the reputation as the best poor man's country in the world. Poverty in America was going to mean a very different thing than being a 17th century or 16th century serf or peasant in Russia or in southern France was going to mean being poor. Being a peasant was going to be a very different thing than being a poor person here. And in terms of local government and voting, that played in as well. The New England town meeting was going to lead to this tradition, this kind of emotional, mental, political, social baggage of people carrying over their own voices from government and contributing. In fact, in local office holding in New England, 1 in 10 individuals would take their turn serving in local office. So there was this common experience that people had with government, but being part of the government, at the local level at least. And so this is going to play into an awful lot of American history and the idea of what the virtuous citizen ought to be doing by contributing, by having a voice in the local control of affairs of their nation state, by starting at the community level and working on beyond there.